Chapter 4. Perfume Oil. The caravan left a tremendous vogue of perfumed oil in its wake. Every palace woman who passed by seemed to carry a different scent. Each smell individually might have been quite pleasant, but they mingled together into an undifferentiated olfactory morass. Mama, with her keen sense of smell, found it a little trying. What made it worse was that the imported perfume from the West wasn't subtle, but carried powerful scents. Mama wasn't the only one who found life a little harder because of the new trend. When she went to the laundry area, she discovered piles and piles of perfume-soaked clothing, the eunuchs responsible for cleaning it frowning deeply as they fetched bucket after bucket of water. Such vogues tended to go as suddenly as they came. The craze for manicures had waned, so everyone needed something new to grab onto. Interest in novels continued to flourish, perhaps because books and perfume were completely different from each other. Shalon was every bit as annoyed as Mama by the perfume since it meant more work for her, but she continued to study industriously in order to read her fresh new copy of the novel. Mama, who had admittedly expected Shalon's efforts to trail off after a few days, was impressed. "Gah, it stinks," Mama grumbled to herself as she set down a basket of laundry. Just being here threatened to make her feel drunk on the odors. She stood lethargically, but apparently she was in the way because a serving girl with a basket full of clothing bumped right into her. Mama ended up wearing some of the laundry. "I'm so sorry," said the maid, whose voice was still high. Whomever the laundry belonged to, she was apparently also a disciple of the newest trend, for the clothes reeked of roses. Roses, huh? Was it wrong for Mama to think about how much money she might get for the rose water she'd made the other day? She'd made plenty of it, but hadn't used any for the time being, just held on to it, for essence of rose could have a negative impact on pregnancy. It would probably be fine so long as Consort Gyokyo didn't use whole heaps of it, but no one ever knew, and it was best to be careful. As such, Mama had been looking for an opportunity to sell the stuff in the pleasure district before it went bad. She plucked the clothing off of her head with a growl, then she blinked and gave the outfit a good sniff. That alarmed the maid, but Mama ignored her, tossing the outfit into the laundry basket and shoving her face into another one. Now nearby eunuchs and other serving women were watching her in amazement, but what did she care? Mama went from one basket to the next, smelling the contents, and by the time she was done, it had completely slipped her mind to take her own washing back home. Instead, she headed off somewhere. Mama, of all people, knew where trends were most likely to take root. That day, the shouting of the ladies-in-waiting of the Crystal Pavilion could be heard all over the rear palace. The gorgeous eunuch appeared at the Jade Pavilion that evening. She figured he might. In his hand, he held what appeared to be a written protest. "I took you for someone with a little more restraint," Jinshi said, his customary exasperation now tinged with anger. Behind him stood Gaoxuan, exasperation coupled with exhaustion, Consort Gyokyo, worried but undeniably intrigued, and Hangyang, only just managing not to look like a wrathful deity. The other ladies-in-waiting were asleep with Princess Lingley, who had already gone Betty-bye. I am, Mama thought, but it was too late. A great deal of proof was required in order to turn speculation into certainty. The Crystal Pavilion had been the perfect place to get it, and Mama had, one might say, succumbed to her curiosity. "My apologies. I let the excitement get away with me, and did it without getting their permission." "You sound like some old lech making excuses for himself." That was the last thing Mama wanted to hear from a certified actual lech, but for the time being, she kept her eyes on the ground and tried to look penitent. "Next time I'll be sure to ask before I go smelling things." "But why were you smelling them?" Jinshi sounded distraught. "Goodness," Gyokyo said, blinking. This seemed to alert Jinshi to how he was coming across because his stern look softened somewhat and he regained a measure of his usual gentleness. Anyway, Mau had learned her lessons. Specifically, she had learned that she was going to need to check with people before she grabbed their clothes and started sniffing. She'd learned not to let her excitement cause her to practically tear the garments off of people so she could smell them. And she'd definitely learned not to choose the ladies-in-waiting of the Crystal Pavilion as the subjects of her sniffing. They'd already treated her like a demon or an evil spirit, but now they seemed to regard her as something even worse. Even knowing what might happen, Mamo had needed to be sure. "I think that's about enough penitence for now," she decided. She raised her head and looked Jinshi square in the eye. In her mind, it was actually a good thing that the complaint had brought Jinshi here so quickly. She believed this matter required an immediate decision. "I had a reason for what I did." She continued to stare at Jinshi for several seconds. Finally, he opened his mouth, though he kept his face blank. "It had better be a good one." But of course, Mao Mao said firmly. Then she glanced at Gyokyo and Hongyang and asked for some paper. Some promptly appeared. It was from Gyokyo's personal store. Frankly, it was nicer than Mao Mao needed right now. A piece of old scrap paper would have been fine, she thought, but she was the only one here who came from poverty, and thus the only one to have such an idea. She began to write in quick, flowing characters while the others surrounded the desk and watched. Consort Gyokyo read aloud. Rose, benzoin, parasol tree, frankincense, and cinnamon. These are all kinds of perfume or some such, right? Mao Mao nodded. These are the aromas and essences I detected on the palace women today. What about them? Jinshi asked, sticking his hands in his sleeves. None of them were present in any significant quantity, Mao Mao said, setting her brush against the inkstone, but all are potentially harmful to a pregnancy. That cast a pall over her audience. She went on. In addition to the various perfume oils, the caravan was selling spices and teas. She produced the ones she had purchased for herself. The jasmine tea, along with peppers, moderately expensive black pepper, rock salt, and cinnamon, which could easily serve in both food and perfume. There's a translation error in the last sentence. The first pepper, after talking about the jasmine tea, should actually be mustard. So the sentence should read, the jasmine tea, along with mustard, moderately expensive black pepper, rock salt, and cinnamon, which could easily serve in both food and perfume. All very much in character for Mao Mao with her preference for dry, spicy foods. She was a little chagrined by how much she'd brought, but, well, the money had been there. She told herself she should have noticed then and there, but Mao Mao, it turned out, was not immune to the festive atmosphere. Jasmine tea has the potential to induce contractions, she said. I don't think a small amount should be anything to worry about, but to avoid any possibility of a miscarriage, I think you should abstain from it entirely. It was the very tea Mao Mao Xiaolan and the others had drunk at the medical office the other day. And then these spices. Peppers frequently appear in the abortifacients used by prostitutes. And again, another translation error here. The peppers should, again, be mustard. So it would read, and then these spices. Mustard frequently appear in the abortifacients used by prostitutes. Mao Mao glanced at Gyokyo. She clearly understood that this matter was a serious one. She looked at Mao Mao intently and nodded. Go on. Hongyang seemed eager that Gyokyo not be exposed to too much distressing talk, but she respected the consort's opinion enough not to intervene. So using these ingredients will increase the chance of a miscarriage? Jinshi asked. Mao Mao was non-committal. He was both right and wrong. Each of them increases the possibility, but none of them is guaranteed to cause one, presuming you don't accidentally drink the perfume oil or otherwise come in contact with an exceptionally large dose. In ordinary quantities, all of the ingredients could practically be called safe. Otherwise, they couldn't be brought into the rear palace at all, but any given thing had multiple uses. If the ingredients were to be found around the Jade Pavilion and by some mistake someone were to ingest them, who knew what might happen? What if that person was a pregnant consort? Mao Mao rued her failure to notice sooner. Can you get any kind of information on the merchants who were here with the caravan? She asked. We can look into it, but I don't expect detailed lists of their wares. Perfumes would simply be listed as perfumes, spices as spices, and tea as tea. Specific types and varieties were unlikely to be recorded. All the incoming merchandise had been inspected, however, giving everyone involved the sense that their job had been done to satisfaction and leaving little room for complaint. One more thing nagged at Mao Mao. Doesn't this remind you of, Remind me of what? Jinshi replied, unsure what her vague remark was getting at. She was thinking of something that seemed like perfectly respectable merchandise for the rear palace, but which could have an unexpected side effect. The toxic face powder, Mao Mao said, and a flash of understanding could be seen on every face in the room. The summer before, Princess Lingli had fallen ill for reasons unknown. Simultaneously, the same thing had happened to Consort Liwa's son, the heir apparent, who had subsequently died. Now a non-lead-based face whitener was used in the rear palace, and the old stuff was no longer allowed. Perhaps it had caused them to let their guard down. Are you suggesting someone is deliberately trying to smuggle poison into the rear palace? Jinshi ventured. Mao Mao didn't nod, but she didn't shake her head either. All she had at the moment was speculation, not proof. She felt close to certainty, but there was always the possibility she was wrong. There was a resemblance to a previous incident, then the fact that the resurrected palace servant, Suide, was still at large, and that her background and contacts remained obscure. Maybe Jinshi had discovered something on that subject, but he was under no obligation to tell Mao Mao. I only noticed that many substances that are potentially harmful have entered the rear palace. No one of them need really be treated as poisonous. She was cheating a little, couching everything she said as opinion. She disliked the idea that the merchants who had brought the products into the rear palace might be punished because of anything she said. She would let Jinshi make up his own mind. I think, though, that it would be wise to warn the other consorts as well. That was all she would say. The discussion had left Mau exhausted. She remembered what her father had said. She could almost hear the old man's gentle, grandmotherly voice warning her not to speak based on assumptions. So how much of what she had said was an assumption, and how much was certain? The question made her feel a little queasy. Mau entered the kitchen and heated some water. When it had boiled, she cut it with some cold water and poured it into a glass cup, where the bulb of jasmine tea waited. The glass was an expensive piece of drinkware, but it was all right. She would be sure to wash it thoroughly when she was done. Mau had already used up her jasmine tea, unfortunately, but Shisui had given hers back. She'd had some now, she said, and didn't need more all to herself. Mau might have preferred if Shisui had simply accepted the gift, but she didn't want to argue. Anyway, she liked this tea. Her sisters had let her taste it on the sly when there were no customers around, and drinking it now took her back. The blossom began to soften and open in the warm water. Mau sat in a chair and watched it. The fragrant aroma filled the air around her. "I thought that was supposed to be poisonous, no?" a gorgeous voice said from above her. She looked up to see a face as pretty as the voice, lit by the single paper lantern that was burning in the kitchen. It was already dark outside. The lantern light gave Jinshi's face a reddish cast. He really was disgustingly lovely. "Many poisons have medicinal properties in small quantities," she replied. "A single cup of tea would barely have any effect of any kind. Anyhow, this is the kitchen. Hardly the sort of place you belong, Master Jinshi." "Don't quibble." "Where's Master Gauchwin?" "I sent him to deliver a message." The eunuch's august status didn't stop Mau from pursing her lips at him. She held up the tea, the jasmine blossom now fully open to the lamplight, and inspected it. Then she took a sip, enjoying the way the flower bobbed in the water. She knew it was rude not to offer Jinshi any tea, but it was after hours, time for him to go home. "Besides," Mau added, "I'm not pregnant." "True enough." For some reason, Jinshi glanced away from her as he spoke. He was sitting diagonally across from her. When had he seated himself? "Not going to give me any tea?" he asked, eyeing the glass cup and the flower. "What kind of tea would you like, sir?" Mau stood, grumbling silently about what a headache Jinshi could be. There was a shelf stocked with provisions for when visitors came, though. Maybe he'd like a nice, simple white tea. Jinshi continued studying her glass. "I'd like to try some of this." "I'm afraid that's the last of it." She'd poured the last steep in her glass. She could add more hot water, but all Jinshi would get would be the dregs. "I don't mind. What other effects does this tea have?" Jinshi shifted in his chair, looking at the leaves. "It encourages relaxation, for one thing. It can help with insomnia, but can also help one wake up. Additionally, while it isn't recommended during pregnancy, I've heard it can be helpful during childbirth." "It seems the benefits far outweigh the harms." "Yes, which is why people often lose sight of them." Was this the only time so much jasmine tea had come into the rear palace, or had it been brought here before as well? Mau didn't know. It might be a simple coincidence or something more. She couldn't even be sure of that. It was possible that the tea, along with the clothing, was a way of feeling them out, a method for discovering if anyone in the rear palace was with child. When previous caravans had visited, Mau had either been working at Jinshi's residence or tending to Consort Liwa in the Crystal Pavilion, or simply without money when it came to the occasion before she had been assigned to Consort Gyokyo's service. In other words, for lack of opportunity or lack of means, she had always been entirely uninterested in the visiting merchants. Even now, if it hadn't been for the sudden perfume oil fad, Mau would likely not have noticed anything. Individually, everything the caravan brought appeared to be excellent luxury goods after all. "Will white tea do?" Jinshi looked a bit put out and said nothing, but it wasn't her fault. They didn't have what they didn't have. Mau set the kettle on the fire again and put some leaves in a small teapot. She took the kettle off before it boiled, figuring warm water would be enough, then poured it into the teapot slowly, letting the leaves steep. From there, she poured the tea into a teacup and placed it in front of Jinshi. He took it, still looking annoyed. Mau, meanwhile, made a show of picking up her glass of jasmine tea. "There's another condition this tea can help with," she said. "What's that?" "Impotence, particularly in men." Jinshi fixed her with a thoroughly unamused look. Oops, she thought. Her sarcasm had worked a little too well. She bustled over to the shelf to get some snacks in hope of repairing his mood, feeling a droplet of cold sweat run down her back. Behind her, she heard him sipping tea, then he said, "This isn't really for me. I'm going home." And just like that, he left. Now I've done it, she thought, scowling to herself. When she went to get his teacup, though, she discovered it was untouched. Instead, her jasmine tea, from which she'd taken only a single sip, was half empty. She drank every drop of the white tea, furious. Chapter 5. Corpse Fungus, Part 1. Mao Mao was now teaching Xiaolan to read and write at the laundry area on an almost daily basis. Evidently, Xiaolan wasn't the only maid who wanted to improve her literacy, for more and more of the women could be seen taking peeks at the characters scratched into the dust and trying to imitate them. More and more. Though really only meant about 5 people, including Xiaolan, the rest were still perfectly happy to pass the time gossiping as they always had. The unfortunate thing about Xiaolan's studious turn was that Mao Mao heard fewer of the palace rumors. Thus, the first thing she learned of this particular tale was from the quack doctor. One of the palace women disappeared. That's what they say. A terrible turn of events, the quack said, stroking his measly beard. Mao Mao sipped some nondescript tea as she listened. Her term of service was nearly up, and she'd even saved a passable dowry, so she was supposed to get married and leave the rear palace. I wonder whatever could have happened to her. The rumor held that the woman had met a civil official at one of the garden parties the year before last, and that they had been communicating by letter ever since. It was the old send-em-a-hair stick routine. Capable women, even if they didn't serve one of the upper consorts, might be permitted excursions outside the rear palace to help with specific tasks. For such a distinguished person to simply disappear was quite strange. Not to say that it never happens, the quack mumbled. In those words, Mao Mao felt as if she might brush up against the darkness within the rear palace, and she didn't like it. A garden with 2,000 women must have its shadows. On occasion, women had even killed themselves because of trouble with colleagues in the palace, although Mao Mao had never personally known anyone who had done so. Other times, a woman's family might find it congenial that she should leave palace service, and she would vanish with no warning and without so much as a word of farewell. There was a tacit understanding that such disappearances would not be investigated too closely. In this case, though, because the woman had been supposed to get married, strange speculations began swirling. Supposedly, the girl was bought by the matron of the serving women herself, though, so no one wanted to pry too much, the doctor said as he bit into a rice cracker. Gracious, Mao Mao replied. She just tried to carry on with her usual work. The story had nothing to do with her. At least, she hadn't thought so. When Mao Mao got back to the Jade Pavilion, she found some very elegant nobles out in the courtyard, where some furniture had been moved to create a tea party that simply oozed high society. On one side of the table sat Gyokyo. Her belly had swollen substantially by now, but she strategically used the surrounding shrubbery to de-emphasize the bulge when she could. She was also wearing clothing that hid the exact shape of her body. It would prevent people from knowing she was pregnant at a glance. Hongyang stood beside her lady, looking tense. Gyokyo staying inside forever was yet another thing that would raise suspicions, so she was letting herself be seen here. Even so, anyone who was going to figure it out would have done so long ago, Mao Mao thought. The question was whether anyone meant good or ill. When she saw Mao Mao was back, Gyokyo suggested moving inside. She stood and Hongyang walked alongside her to conceal the consort's profile. She knew just which angle her lady would be most obvious from. Jinshi slipped a glance at Mao Mao. Something must be up, she thought, and followed them into the pavilion's reception area. Pardon me very much, she said as she entered. Consort Gyokyo was looking at her with her usual fidgety excitement, while Hongyang could barely conceal how tired she was. As for the one who had summoned Mao Mao, he was sitting in a chair coolly sipping some tea. Gao Xuan stood beside him, looking indignant. You called? Mao Mao looked back and forth between Gyokyo and Jinshi. Yes, I believe he has some business with you. Gyokyo gestured at Jinshi with an open palm. This was how it always started. I do, and if you don't mind, we'll find somewhere for a quiet chat. Oh, you needn't trouble yourself. You can talk right here, the red-haired consort said, clearly a bit peeved. I'm afraid we very much cannot. It wouldn't do for me to stay here too long, and besides, the princess seems to be about ready for her nap. A crying child could be heard from outside. It was almost time for Ling Li's afternoon nap, but before she went to sleep, she always had some of her mother's milk. They would have to think about weaning her soon, but it would take some time yet. Gyokyo adopted an almost girlish expression. The consort was pregnant with her second child, but she was still a young woman, just 20 years old. The exotic blood in her veins gave her a rather adult appearance, enhanced by her no-nonsense personality. Together, they could make her seem quite old and experienced, but she was still bursting with youthful curiosity. "Lady Gyokyo, may I suggest you give in here?" Hong Yang, ever prepared to make sure work was getting done, opened the door of the room. Gai Yuan was outside holding the child and looking distinctly awkward. Hong Yang took Ling Li and held her out to Gyokyo. The princess reached for the consort's collar. Gyokyo's face was still stormy, but she could hardly leave her dear, sweet child to starve, and she finally allowed Maomao and Jinshi to show themselves out of the room. The two of them left the Jade Pavilion and worked their way, as so often, to the office of the matron of the serving women. The man needs his own damn room, Mama thought. She had an idea. Maybe they could renovate the spare storeroom in the medical office. Then the quack doctor would naturally feel obligated to bring them tea when they visited, at least. Mama could relax, and the matron could stop being constantly interrupted. It was effectively 3 birds with 1 stone. The matron's room was large but unadorned, without much to hold the interest, and since they had chased everyone else out, there was no one to bring them tea either. At Gaoxuan's urging, Maomao seated herself in one of the simple chairs. "What is it you need, sir?" she asked. "I think you know that His Majesty has been lately distributing fiction novels to the consorts." Jinshi was simply assuming she knew about them, which, of course, she did, so she nodded. "Yes, sir, my understanding is that after the consorts have read them, they're to allow their ladies-in-waiting to read them, and then the ladies below those. Some copies are making the rounds as well. It's even inspired some women to learn to read." Jinshi smiled a bit at that. Maomao could see she'd been right. He had planned this all along. Gaoxuan passed to Jinshi a scroll, which he unrolled on the table. "What's this?" Maomao asked. "My goal, although we're still in the early stages. In the long run, this is what I'd like to create." The scroll showed a plan of the rear palace. In the open space that was currently the plaza, however, there were several buildings. "In the marketplace, I believe what I have in mind might be called an Institute of Practical Studies." In other words, a school. Maomao's eyes widened in appreciation. She'd suspected he was probably already thinking along such lines, but she was impressed at how quickly he moved. Although she often regarded Jinshi as if observing a bug or some filth, today she looked at him as if she were looking at a horse. It was a sign of how much she liked the idea, but for some reason Jinshi and Gaoxuan both recoiled. "Is something the matter, sirs?" "No, it just doesn't quite feel right," Jinshi said. Even Gaoxuan had something to say. "Yes, what happened to your normal expression? Are you feeling unwell?" Maomao allowed her eyelids to droop, so she looked rather more skeptical. Jinshi let out a relieved breath and sat forward again. Why did he look so satisfied? Was the eunuch actually a secret masochist? "What do you think?" he asked, now that he had composed himself. Maomao rubbed her chin thoughtfully. It wasn't a bad idea. In fact, it was a pretty good one. First, they distribute the novels throughout the rear palace via the emperor to gauge the reaction. They'd been able to get the young lady's attention, and she could see the idea was more than just an impulse. "I think it's excellent. There are some people here who genuinely want to learn, and even more importantly, it will do them some good after their term of service ends." "Yes, certainly," Jinshi said, starting to smile. The expression might have caused some swooning if he hadn't chased everyone out already. One thing bothered Maomao, though. She stared intently at the scroll. "What is it?" Jinshi asked anxiously. Maomao pointed to something on the plans. The current projected site for the institute was in the southern quarter of the rear palace, the plaza just near the main gate. It was more than large enough, and it would be easy to transport materials there, certainly an advantage. The emperor would have to put up with it during construction, but since it was his idea, maybe that wasn't such an issue. Not everyone, though, was willing to accept new things. Maomao looked hard at Jinshi. He nodded, silently giving her permission to speak her mind, so she said, "The southern quarter is where one finds the upper and middle consorts. Many, even if perhaps not all of them, are ladies of great pride. With the building in its planned position, not only the emperor but all the consorts would be constantly exposed to the sight of base illiterates gathering to receive their education. Surely not everyone would take kindly to that." Jinshi was quiet. As one of the eunuchs of the rear palace, he knew the place well. He would understand what Maomao was driving at. The consorts would all put on brave faces, but some might secretly begin campaigns of harassment. The consorts themselves might not deign to get their hands dirty, but they could employ their ladies-in-waiting or the maids to do things. They wouldn't target the building itself either, but the other palace women who started going there. I think the northern quarter might be preferable, Jinshi declared. The north was the most isolated part of the rear palace. Very few consorts went there on purpose. Yes, sir, and I dare say there's no need to build an entirely new facility there. You could simply renovate one of the many abandoned structures already available. Frankly, Mama thought it would be a waste of resources to build something new. No matter how much pull Jinshi might have, he could be expected to smash the lovely nose off his face if it could save the money. Mama wasn't done offering ideas, though. One other thing, sir, she said. I might suggest that rather than openly building the place as a school, it be presented as professional training for those who aspire for better positions. A school is seen as all about studying. You have to lure them in by making it clear that going there will help them eat. Is that so? Yes, farmers' children are constantly aware of the dangers of hunger. And speaking of eating, perhaps you could offer a snack during the break sometimes. Daily snacks, excellent idea, Jinshi said, nodding. No, sir. Only sometimes. You mustn't feed them every day. Why not? If snacks were offered on a daily basis, some people would come only when they wanted to eat. Make the snacks unpredictable, take away the guarantee that one would be able to eat at these classes, and people would come every day to make sure they didn't miss a meal. You really think so? What gambler was ever hooked on a game where they won every time? Jinshi didn't respond. His overall idea was a good one, but she could see touches of naivete that came from his fine upbringing. He seemed to recognize the same thing. That was why he was here asking for her opinion. These are only my subjective observations. You might want to ask others for their thoughts as well, she said. She wasn't out of observations, but she decided she'd said enough. She couldn't have them simply going along with everything she said and thought. She wasn't sure it had been necessary to leave the Jade Pavilion to have this conversation. She glanced at Jinshi, wondering if she was free to leave yet, but then Galshwin produced more papers still. There's something else, Jinshi said. Are you knowledgeable about mushrooms? Mau frowned, wondering what this was about. I've always gone into the mountains to find them a few times each year, as they're important for both cooking and making medicines. There were plenty of poisonous mushrooms out there, but there was also no small number that could be turned into valuable remedies. Are they of interest to you? Mama forced herself to hold back the grin that threatened to spread across her face. A few palace women get food poisoning every year around this time. We warn them, but there's always someone who ignores us. Some appetites are simply bigger than others, Mama said. No one was going to starve in the rear palace, but there were some who found the meals provided to be insufficient. The only ones who could expect a snack during the day were the attendants of the consorts, or else those with whom someone deigned to share a treat. Why, last year, someone even supposedly had some mushrooms in the medical office with the doctor himself. Mamau didn't say anything to that. And fruit seems to go missing from the orchards on a startlingly regular basis. Or that, privately, she wanted to object that those mushrooms hadn't been poisonous, but in fact quite delicious. As for the fruit, she just helped to make space so the remaining fruit could ripen better. At least that was her excuse. Thus, what I want is to preempt any wayward palace women. I want to get rid of the mushrooms before anyone can accidentally eat them. As we do so, I want you to tell me exactly what kind of poison each one contains. You'll be exempt from your duties at the Jade Pavilion except for food tasting. Mama nodded, but she was thinking this was a little strange. So far, they hadn't said anything that couldn't have been discussed in front of Consort Kyokyo. If anything, it would have been convenient for her to get the full story about the mushroom inspections. There's still something he's not telling me, Mama thought, but she wasn't so oblivious as to say that out loud. In fact, she was perfectly happy with Jinshi's request. The job would be nothing if not interesting. She said only, "Very well, sir," the smallest of smiles on her lips. There were plenty of places mushrooms might grow in the rear palace. It was often called a garden of women, but plenty of actual plants grew there too, including pots of carefully tended flowers and trees, fruit orchards, and pine groves. The humidity of the warm season would soon mean mushrooms everywhere. One of the trickiest things about mushrooms was that edible and poisonous ones often looked very much alike. Oyster mushrooms and moonlight mushrooms, for example, were easily confused, and there had been cases of food poisoning in the pleasure district when customers had unintentionally given the wrong one as a gift. Some places were more congenial to mushrooms than others. Oyster mushrooms would grow virtually anywhere, but moonlight mushrooms were more common in the mountains. Mama doubted they would find any of those in the rear palace. If they were going to conduct a mushroom hunt, Mama figured they could ignore places frequented by the gardeners. That included anywhere the emperor was apt to come for flower viewing. Most such places were in the southern quarter, which was where the upper and middle consorts had their residences, and was thus packed with proud ladies. Those areas would be kept free of mushrooms. So where should we start, Mama thought, looking at the plans Jinchi had provided, her feet barely touching the ground. Welcome back, Yinghua said, sounding a bit unsure of herself. Thanks, good to be back. Hey, you can't go in there like that, Yinghua said, brushing Mama's head and clothes gently. She had leaves in her hair and twigs stuck in her robes. Must have been that tree she'd climbed. I don't know what they've got you doing out there, but I wish you'd stop coming back such a wreck. Such a wreck, Mama thought. Yinghua certainly told it like it was. Mama nodded, though. She had to respect that they were trying to keep things sanitary, given that there was a small child and a pregnant woman around. She went for a quick change of clothes and dusted herself off. It had been a very fulfilling day for Mama. She'd gathered an entire basket full of mushrooms, including quite a few medicinal ones. She'd told the quack they were poisonous. She figured that would keep him from even trying to eat them. Granted, he'd hardly looked able to restrain himself even so, but she would just have to trust him. Mau the cat proved wiser than the quack. She hadn't even spared the mushrooms a glance. Having found a bounty of unusual fungus, though, Mau the human was feeling quite satisfied. Mama, you kind of smell like something, Yinghua said. Do I? Now that she thought about it, her nose had stung a bit when she was out collecting mushrooms. Maybe it was from all the running around, or maybe it was from that place Shisui had told her about. There had been lots of mushrooms there. The overflowing wastewater seemed to make a good fertilizer. Lady Gyokyo will be having dinner. Once you're changed, will you be able to... Yes, the day wasn't over yet, Mama realized. It seemed a little earlier than usual for dinner, but it wouldn't do for the food taster to be late. I'll be right there, she said, and shuffled quickly back to her room. When she arrived at Consort Gyokyo's quarters, the woman was tying a black string around her wrist. That was typical practice in the rear palace when someone of noble status had passed on, but this string was less elaborate than the ones that had been used when the crown prince had died. Gyokyo was dressed as she always was. Instead, it was Hongyang who wore plainer clothes than usual. I'm sorry, guess I'm a little early, Consort Gyokyo said. It's quite all right, my lady. Hongyang must have seen the implicit question on Mama's face because she said, I have to go out after dinner today. I'm sorry, but I'll need you to come with me. Yes, ma'am. She understood perfectly well why Hongyang was dressed so somberly. Hongyang gave Mamo a black band as well. They were on their way to a funeral, she surmised. Such things were ordinarily considered unfit for the rear palace, in which the Son of Heaven might be born, but they simply called it something else and did it anyway. From the fact that Hongyang was attending in Gyokyo's place, Mama suspected it was one of the middle or lower-ranked consorts who had died. You can wear the clothes you have on, but take off that hair tie, Hongyang instructed. Mamao nodded and took the first dish to taste for poison. Hongyang brought Mamao to a ritual site in the northern quarter. In a country that loved ceremonies and observances as much as this one, even the rear palace had a small place to host them. This one normally went unadorned, but the eunuchs had clearly exerted themselves to get it ready for this funeral in short order. About once a year, Gyokyo was expected to serve as the officiant at a ritual, but so far the role hadn't come to her during Mamao's time in her service. Such offices were usually the province of men, but in the special circumstances of the rear palace, women could take the job. The duty passed from one upper consort to the next in sequence. The funeral attendees formed two lines in front of the altar, where they were offering flowers passed out by women who appeared to be ladies-in-waiting to the late consort. Mamao stood behind Hongyang and accepted a flower from one of the ladies. It didn't smell the way such blossoms normally did, though. Perhaps another unique facet of the rear palace. Mama noticed that the hand of the woman who had given her the flower was red. Is that a rash? The hand was noticeably swollen. Mama glanced at her own left arm. One of the scars there resembled the woman's swelling. These thoughts were still running through Mama's head as she approached the altar to offer her flower. There was a large coffin draped in a white cloth. Maybe she would be moved later, through the cloth. Mama could just make out a human silhouette inside. According to Hongyang, the deceased consort was the daughter of a high official, a woman of notable status among the middle consorts, but Mama guessed from Hongyang's tone that the woman hadn't been very likable. About a year before, her health had started to fail. She'd shut herself up in her room but hadn't gone back to her family home. The emperor never visited her. She could certainly have gone home if she'd wanted to, Hongyang had remarked with an acerbic touch in her voice. Then, just when the consort was weakest, the weather had turned warm and she'd gotten about a food poisoning. It was unusual for the normally disciplined Hongyang to tear into a dead person like that. When the two of them had gotten out of the flower line, Mamao said quietly, Did she do something? It was an offhanded question. She didn't necessarily expect Hongyang to tell her. It was more than a lady-in-waiting needed to know. To her surprise, though, Hongyang whispered back, "You remember someone once attempted to poison Lady Gyokyo. They never found the culprit, but—" Hongyang glanced toward the coffin. Now it made sense. Hongyang was intensely loyal. Of course she would resent anyone she suspected of trying to harm her mistress. She might even be secretly relieved the woman was dead. Wait, an idea formed in Mamao's mind. This middle consort, dead of food poisoning, had made an attempt on Gyokyo's life. The very Gyokyo who was presently pregnant and thus more cautious than usual around the other consorts and palace women. Then there was Jinshi's request the day before that Mamao find all the poisonous mushrooms. He'd taken such care that Gyokyo and the others not know what he'd asked. Removing any sentiment for the residents of the Jade Pavilion from the equation, it was impossible to say for certain that Gyokyo hadn't poisoned the middle consort before the dead woman could do the same to her. Food poisoning was the official word, but if the cause had been a mushroom, then everything would fit together. Mamao could easily imagine what would happen if the other women of the Jade Pavilion knew what Jinshi was thinking. Even the gorgeous eunuch could expect his reception there to change if they found out. Mamao sometimes thought Jinshi was perhaps a little too much Gyokyo's personal ally, but in this matter at least, he was being scrupulously fair. Doubt Consort Gyokyo had anything to do with it. She might not have been fond of the other consort, but there were any numbers of ways to break an opponent's spirit and ensure it didn't come back. Trying to poison someone just in case they attempted to poison you again seemed a great deal of trouble. There was always the possibility of being found out, nor did Hongyang or the other 3 girls of the Jade Pavilion seem like the kind to resort to such underhanded methods. No, in any attempted poisoning, the prime suspect at the Jade Pavilion would be Mamao. If Jinshi's aim was the matter of the mushrooms had been to gauge Mamao's reaction, she wasn't upset. She was even a little impressed. Mamao hadn't done anything to get her hands dirty, of course. I wonder what kind of food poisoning the woman did die of. Mamao would be very pleased to find out, but she sighed, knowing it would be difficult. She was just about to follow Hongyang back to the Jade Pavilion when there was a stupendous crash. She turned and saw that a woman with her face wrapped in bandages had upset the altar. The offering, rice, and wine were scattered on the floor. Puffy red skin could be seen peeking out from under the woman's bandages. Her outfit was plain, but it was of fine material, not like the uniforms the maids wore. She was no simple palace woman, nor a lady-in-waiting either, Mamao suspected. "Stop that!" cried a palace woman as she grabbed the interloper, but the other woman shook her off and stood in front of the coffin, where she ripped off the white cloth that covered it. The assembled women gasped, cried out, and scattered. Even the strong-stomached Hongyang gave a yelp. A woman lay there, dressed in white. The skin of her face was red and swollen, and half the hair on her head had fallen out. She looked almost as if she'd been fried in oil, hardly what one would call a blossoming flower of the rear palace. The intruder grinned through her bandages. "Ha ha ha! You see now? You reap what you sow," she cried, even as a group of eunuchs arrived to restrain her. "You're more hideous than I ever was." Her laughter filled the twilight. Mamao studied them both, the dead body and what she could see of the other woman's face through her bandages. The wounds, almost like burns, looked familiar to her.